The junction box on subdeck 47 had been throwing error codes for 6 days, which was 6 days longer than I could afford to pretend it belonged to somebody else. 300 meters below the last inhabited corridor, the procession stopped pretending to be young. Up on the residential decks, walls came in polymer panels with standardized fasteners and color-coded access ports. Down here, in the maintenance strata where I spent most of my shifts, every surface carried the work of generations who had kept the ship alive by refusing to let it fail in the same place twice. Conduit bolted over conduit, emergency patch over older emergency patch. My grandfather's welds over his father's. Beneath those layers, the walls turned to a dark mineral composite, no manual named with confidence, and no engineer I trusted claimed to understand. My name is Curtis Polk. I am a lower-deck maintenance engineer on the Procession, a generational starship so old the official launch date exists in 3 different records, and 2 of them are treated as scripture. I fix what breaks. I trace faults. I keep lower corridors warm, lit, and pressurized, and in return the ship gives me a bunk, a ration card, and access to crawl spaces no one else wants. The junction box sat where 2 primary power conduits crossed on subdeck 47, at the end of a maintenance corridor too narrow to walk. I had to belly crawl the last 15 meters with my diagnostic kit dragging at my heels. The error codes were ordinary enough. Voltage irregularities, impedance spikes, the kind of dirty signal you got from a corroding relay that had lasted 5 years past its rated lifespan because nobody wanted to shut down a corridor to replace it. 3-hour job. 4 if the bolts fought me. I had been mapping the ship's primary power grid for 5 weeks. Officially, it was an efficiency audit commissioned by the Lower Deck Supervisory Board, one of those annual exercises that generated fresh diagrams for old systems and a report nobody with authority ever read. I had done 3 of them in 12 years. They were methodical, dull, and only useful when they uncovered something somebody had hoped would stay buried. This one had. The ship's main power feed, the trunk line carrying generated energy from propulsion to habitation, recycling, gravity, climate, light, ran downward exactly as the manual said it should. I traced it junction by junction, relay by relay, through 36 subdecks of documented infrastructure. Then the line crossed the boundary of the lowest maintained level and entered the mortuary processing deck. According to every official schematic, the mortuary deck was a distribution node. Power flowed in, split across cold storage, sanctification equipment, chapel systems, processing pumps. My instruments showed the opposite. Power flowed out. The net energy vector stayed reversed across every sample I took. Generation was happening down there, and the rest of the ship was taking what the mortuary deck produced. I replaced the relay in the junction box, resealed the housing, and opened the waveform archive I had been building in secret for 3 weeks. The pattern held. High amplitude, organically noisy, irregular in a way no reactor signature should ever be irregular. It looked like bioelectric discharge under extreme systemic stress. In my 20s, I spent 2 years on damage control. I had seen med telemetry from hull breach survivors and fire victims, from bodies going into shock faster than medicine could reach them. I knew what a nervous system in crisis looked like when it hit a monitor. This looked like thousands of them, overlapping and sustained, a century of agony compressed into signal. I packed my tools and backed out of the crawlway on my elbows. The lift ride toward populated decks took 8 minutes. I spent all 8 staring at the waveform on my lap. Sanctification. On the procession, the word was wrapped in so much reverence that doubting it felt childish and profane. When somebody died, the body was taken to the mortuary chapel. Family gathered. A deacon read the old texts. The dead were laid on the sanctification cradle and commended to the journey. Their strength, we were told, joined the procession. They walked beside those who had gone before. They lent themselves to the long crossing between stars. I had believed it once. At 16, I stood in the chapel with my little sister, clinging hard enough to bruise my hand, while Deacon Ma said my mother's strength would join the journey ahead of us. I remembered the dimmed lights, the hush, the way people touched our shoulders afterward as if grief had become a public sacrament. For 12 years after that, whenever the engines surged in the middle of the night, some part of me had imagined her there among the dead, keeping us moving. The lift passed the mortuary level. Through the narrow window I saw the Hale family in the corridor outside the chapel. Martin Hale, his brother Owen, and their father Gideon walking together with the rigid formality grief gives men raised not to fall apart in public. Martin's son Tommy had died 3 days earlier in a pressure seal accident on subdeck 30. 22 years old, bright, quick with his hands. I had shown him how to read a flow diagram one slow afternoon, when he was still an apprentice and proud to be treated like he belonged in the maintenance shafts. His sanctification was scheduled for the next morning. Tomorrow Tommy Hale's body would be laid on the cradle. The neural hardware hidden inside the liturgical casing would engage. Whatever remained of his nervous system would be used to produce the signal I had been recording for weeks. I sat in the lift with my diagnostic kit on my knees and understood, with the certainty of a snapped fastener, that I had one night to decide what to do about it. I spent that night making copies. Every dataset I had, every waveform, every grid map, every note on reversed energy flow went to a secondary chip. I hid the original archive behind a cable junction in the wall beside my bunk, then pulled the panel back into place and spent an hour lying awake with my eyes open, listening to the ship's low mechanical breathing through the pipes. By 0600 rumour had started to move. It had nothing to do with me at first. Lower deck rumours rarely do. They come up through the grates on their own. Body not released from cold storage, clergy seen arguing in the processing corridor, chapel staff working through the night, sanctification delayed, sanctification accelerated. By the time I reached the mortuary level, 3 different versions were circulating outside the chapel doors, and none of them were close enough to the truth to matter. The chapel was already filling. 40, maybe 50 people. Lower deck workers in clean shirts and work boots polished past usefulness. Neighbours, 2 mid-deck cousins who looked lost among the maintenance families. Deacon Wills stood at the front in formal vestments, his face arranged into the grave serenity clergy practiced until it looked like a profession of its own. I had seen him at funerals before. He was good at grief. He knew how much silence to leave after a family member started crying. He knew where to place his hands on the cradle to suggest blessing rather than procedure. Tommy lay wrapped in shipcloth with only his face exposed. 3 days dead, skin waxen, lips pale. The medical report had listed brain activity ceasing 4 minutes after decompression trauma. Neurologically dark. Martin sat in the front row, rigid enough to look braced for impact. Owen held Gideon upright by the elbow. The old man's mouth worked constantly, as if he were repeating a prayer too quiet for anyone else to hear. I took a place near the back where I could see the cradle's base. Beneath the decorative casing, I knew exactly where the interface sat. Wills began the liturgy. His voice carried beautifully in the cold chamber. Old words, old cadence, joining, strength, journey, the long corridor, the blessing of those who go ahead. The congregation murmured the responses. I heard my own mouth shape none of them. When Wills raised his hand over Tommy's forehead and spoke the committal phrase, the cradle emitted a soft tone. The congregation knew it as the Sanctification chime. I knew it as an engagement signal. Tommy Hale's body convulsed. The first spasm lifted his shoulders off the cradle hard enough to clang the frame against its mounting brackets. At the same instant, the engines surged. Everyone in the room felt it. A deep shudder underfoot, the familiar thrust change of a ship adjusting itself in the dark. The room held still for 1 impossible second. Wills recovered first. The transition is sometimes accompanied by involuntary muscular... Tommy convulsed again. The deck answered again. This time nobody could miss the timing. Dead body, engine, dead body, engine. Martin was on his feet before Wills finished the sentence. The deacon put out a hand, all instinct and no authority. "Please," Wills said, "please remain seated. The sanctification process is sacred and delicate." Tommy's eyes opened. Silence cinched tight across the room. His pupils narrowed and widened in rhythm with the engine cycle. His jaw worked. His mouth opened and shut as if trying to form a word with no one left inside to choose it. The tendons in his neck stood out. His fingers flexed against the cloth. Martin reached him in 3 strides and caught his son's hand. Tommy's fingers closed on his father's wrist. Tight, release, tight, release, timed perfectly to the pulse running under the deck. Martin made a sound I had heard once before in my life, in a fire corridor after a child was pulled out too late. It tore out of him raw and wordless, the sound a body makes when reality has done something too large for speech. People surged backward. A woman near the 3rd row hit the wall hard enough to knock a memorial plaque loose. Gideon Hale sank into Owen's arms with his eyes fixed on Tommy's face. Declan Fossey, who had sanctified his wife in this room 6 years earlier, sat down where he stood as though someone had cut the tendons behind his knees. Wills lunged toward the cradle's manual override. I got there first and caught his wrist. "Don't," I said. His face had gone grey. Up close I could see the professionalism stripped off him like paint in a fire. Underneath it was horror. Beneath that lay something worse than horror. Recognition. "This is a malfunction," he said. "No." He tried to yank free. I held on. Martin was bent over the cradle, pleading with his son. Tommy's hand kept squeezing in time with the ship. Every pulse drew another surge from somewhere deep below us. The room had become an equation simple enough for anyone to read. "It's not a malfunction," I said, loudly enough for the crowd. "Watch him. Watch the deck. That's what sanctification does. The dead aren't joining the ship. The ship is using them." Wills stopped fighting me. For one beat I thought he was going to deny it. Then Tommy's body arched again. The floor rolled under us and Wills's eyes broke. 90 seconds. I gave them 90 seconds because one glance would be denied, argued away, smothered in priestly language and official phrasing. 90 seconds was long enough for disbelief to rot into knowledge. Then I released Wills's arm. He hit the override with both hands. The cradle powered down. Tommy went limp. The engine smoothed out so abruptly the room seemed to sag with the loss of it. Nobody moved toward the body. Martin stayed where he was with his son's hand clasped in both of his. Owen had to pull the wrench out of Declan Fossey's hands when the old man tried to stagger towards the cradle. 2 younger workers near the back shoved the doors open and shouted into the corridor that nobody was to come in. Someone else started sobbing. Someone began praying louder than the liturgy had ever sounded. Wills stood with one hand on the dead machine and stared at Tommy's face as if waiting for the boy to accuse him. I looked at the people in the chapel and understood the room had split open. 40-odd witnesses, 40-odd people who could never again pretend sanctification was metaphor. It would not stay in this room. By noon, the mortuary level was under restricted access. By evening, the lower decks were boiling. The first official notice came from the Office of Ship Governance, temporary suspension of public ceremonies due to equipment malfunction. The second came from the clergy, rare post-mortem neuromuscular discharge in recently deceased tissue, no suffering involved, no doctrinal implications. Neither survived first contact with witnesses. Families started showing up at cold storage demanding bodies back. Supervisors posted corridor watches outside the chapel. Deacons went deck to deck trying to calm people who no longer wanted calming. A pair of governance stewards interviewed half the attendees, and none of them left satisfied. On subdeck 32, somebody painted, "Let them stay dead" across an access hatch. On subdeck 29, someone else painted, "They carry us willingly" beneath it. The second phrase got crossed out before shift change and rewritten twice as large by morning. Martin Hale did not go home. He sat outside the sealed chapel for 10 hours with Owen beside him and told every person who asked that they had watched his dead son used like a machine. That night, Reg Dunmore came to my bunk, closed the door behind him, and asked to see everything. Reg was structural maintenance. Hull, supports, load paths, old sections no one liked putting on reports because old sections generated old questions. He was my closest friend on the lower decks, which on the procession meant we had once dragged each other out of a coolant leak and had never since needed to explain why we trusted one another. He had a wife, 2 daughters on deck 29, and the habit of looking at any problem as if it might collapse on his children first. He watched the waveforms in silence. He watched my reversed flow maps. Then he leaned against the wall above the hidden data chip without knowing it was there and said, "If this is real, the ship tears open. It's real. I know." He rubbed his face. "I'm trying to work out whether that makes you brave or stupid. Those aren't opposite conditions. Not here they aren't." It was Reg who said we needed to know how deep it went before we let lower deck fury decide for us. If the mortuary chain was a corruption layered on top of a decent system, that was one problem. If it was the system, that was another. 2 days after Tommy's funeral, with the chapel still sealed to the public and the lower decks on the edge of open refusal, Reg opened a corroded pressure door below the last maintained subdeck and led me into the oldest part of the ship. 3 levels below the lowest serviced corridor, age stopped looking mechanical and started looking geological. The air was dry enough to sting. Dust lay in the corners in layered mineral drifts. The walls changed under our lamps. At first the material only seemed wrong, too ridged, too warm-toned, too irregular beneath the corrosion. Then I put an ungloved hand against it and felt the grain. Reg saw my face change and touched it himself. Calcium. Mineral accretion over an organic substrate. The wall held the shape and density of bone. We went deeper. The hull revealed itself a piece at a time, as if the ship had been embarrassed to be recognized. Arches crossed the ceiling and resolved into ribs thick as structural beams. Vertically fused spinal columns ran in the keel direction. Broad, flattened plates layered like shingles until the curve of scapulae emerged from the stone. Everywhere, trapped in the calcified matrix, translucent threads of ancient neural tissue had fossilized into glassy filament. My probe touched one exposed line and registered residual charge. The ship's original wiring was human nervous tissue. Compressed, mineralized, integrated into the structure until bone and hull plating had become one composite system, carrying current after 1,000 years of strain. The founders had not installed life support into a ship. They had built the ship around their own bodies. Reg sat down hard on the deck, which under the dust showed the broad, crushed bowls of pelvic bone fused into flooring. He put both hands over his mouth. It was the first time I had seen him look frightened in 12 years. "This was designed," he said through his fingers. "This wasn't done to them later." I was already moving my lamp along the wall. There were cut marks in the calcified surface, etchings old enough that mineral growth had softened their edges but not erased them. Coordinates, ratios, mathematical structures repeated in sequence. One glyph appeared again and again along the keel spine, always aligned in the same direction. "It's a heading," I said. "They carved a heading into the hull." Reg stood and stared where my lamp pointed. Then they chose all of it. I wanted him to be wrong. I had spent the 2 days since Tommy's funeral constructing an easier enemy. Governance, clergy, the Ashworth line, some later corruption grafted onto a sacred rite until reverence turned into exploitation. The deep hull killed that argument for me in minutes. The founders had chosen this. They had written destination into their own bones and died into the structure with intention. Tommy Hale had not chosen. My mother had not chosen, no matter what the liturgy had implied. Neither had Declan Fossey's wife, or the hundreds of ordinary dead who had passed through sanctification as inherited duty. Founders' consent did not redeem any of that. It did change the shape of the crime. "The mutiny still happens," I said. Reg looked at me as if he had expected a better sentence. When? He asked. Before or after you work out what happens when you cut power from 6,000 people? I'll work it out. You'd better. Nera and the girls are on 29. If gravity fails on 29, they hit steel before they know why. That was Reg. His wife and daughters first, always. We climbed out arguing. He wanted estimates, reserve models, alternatives. I wanted proof in enough volume to make denial impossible. At the pressure door, he caught my sleeve and made me meet his eyes. You get one promise from me, he said. I help you find the shape of this. I do not help you kill the ship. I told him I understood. I did. I also knew understanding and obedience were not the same thing. The lower decks were already choosing sides. Some people wanted every Sanctification cradle smashed. Some wanted the chapel reopened under armed guard. Some wanted the Lord himself dragged down to look Martin Hale in the face. Others insisted the right must remain because whatever horror we had uncovered was the horror that kept the walls warm. That night I passed the chapel on my way to subdeck 34 and saw Deacon Wills standing in the corridor alone. He looked 20 years older than he had at Tommy's funeral. He recognized me, hesitated, then said, "You think I knew?" "Did you?" He looked at the sealed chapel doors. "Not like that." It was not an answer. It was more honest than denial. "What did you think sanctification was?" I asked. He closed his eyes. "Communion. Transfer. Something holy and beyond understanding." A tired, bitter breath escaped him. "Those phrases become habits if you say them for long enough. People trusted you." His face tightened, not in anger but in pain. "People trusted me because I stood beside them when they lost everything. I did that part honestly." "That isn't enough." "No," he said. "It isn't." Then he walked away before I could decide whether I hated him more for what he had hidden or for the fact that he no longer looked capable of hiding it from himself. 8 days after Tommy's funeral, a lower deck delegation was granted audience on the bridge. I had spent 12 years below habitation, and nothing in 12 years of pipe runs and crawlways prepared me for the bridge. The chamber was cathedral scale, 40 meters long, maybe 20 wide, vaulted high enough to make sound travel strangely. Every visible surface was built from human remains translated into architecture. Walls of fused skulls and rib cages mortared with calcite. Pillars of vertebrae rising in pale columns. A floor of flattened bone polished by generations of boots. Overhead, femurs and tibia interlocked into arches like Gothic stonework stripped down to anatomy. At the center sat the neural throne. It did not look assembled. It looked grown from the same substrate as the bridge around it, a denser flowering of ancestral material shaped into a seat. Translucent nerve bundles rose from the armrests and headrest in branching tendrils. They entered the man seated there through permanent ports at the base of his skull, along his spine, and in the inner flesh of both forearms. Lionel Ashworth, 7th hereditary lord of the procession, was not the figure lower deck gossip had built for me. I had expected comfortable authority, indulgence, a body protected from work by title. The man on the throne was gaunt, mid-40s perhaps, though chronic strain had pushed him toward age. Scarring radiated from every port, angry tissue, inflamed edges, skin that never healed because it was never left alone long enough to scar. His eyes were the most unsettling part. One focused on whoever addressed him. The other lagged by fractions, shifting at intervals to some inward feed no one else could see. Garrett Lund, his chief steward, stood at his right hand and translated Ashworth's clipped responses into governance language. Our delegation petitioned for replacement parts, ventilation repairs, gravity plate maintenance, crew allotments for decks the upper levels liked to forget existed. I spoke when spoken to. Graves from the supervisory board did most of the talking. I watched the tendrils. They moved, a tightening here, a pulse there, a slow contract and release against Ashworth's skin, like the breathing of something using his nerves as a bellows. The throne was reading him. He was reading the dead. Midway through a tariff dispute between two mid-deck guild representatives, Ashworth seized. Every muscle in his body locked at once. His hands clamped the ulnar-shaped armrests hard enough to whiten the knuckles. The tendrils snapped taut. His head jerked back. Lund stepped toward him with a reflex that looked frightened. Then Ashworth's mouth opened, and a voice came out that was not his. It sounded older than his, rougher, with an accent that belonged to a century the procession no longer spoke in. The words landed with the cadence of somebody used to command before liturgy and bureaucracy had sanded command into ceremony. The voice accused the Ashworth line of betrayal. It named the Third Lord, Ashworth's ancestor 8 generations back, and said he had deviated from the founder's heading to avoid a radiation belt. The deviation had preserved lives in the short term. It had also carried the ship off the trajectory carved into the deep hull. Every lord since had sustained the error, out of cowardice, convenience, ignorance, or fear of what the original route required. The dead remembered the heading. The dead had been correcting for the deviation in increments too small for ordinary governance to read. They had spent 3 centuries dragging the ship back toward where it was always meant to go. Court attendants rushed the throne. Lund grabbed for the spinal feed and failed. Ashworth's own arms fought him. 2 more people joined. The dead kept speaking through the Lord's throat while they physically tore the tendrils free. When the spinal port came loose, blood ran down the back of Ashworth's collar and he collapsed sideways against the throne base. The bridge groaned. The calcified structure itself gave a deep, settling sound, like load-bearing bone releasing stress. The filamentary glow in the wall dimmed. I had not consciously noticed the bridge was lit from within until the light began to fail. Lund ordered the chamber cleared. No one argued. Not the guild delegates, not the lower deck supervisors, not the guards with their polished sidearms. We all stumbled out through corridors of bone with the stunned silence of people who had watched government become possession in front of them. In the lift down, Graves kept opening his mouth and closing it again. By the time I reached subdeck 34, I knew the mutiny could no longer be built around a simple story about a corrupt ruler. The dead themselves wanted something. The ruling family was part of the machine, not merely its beneficiary. That evening I called the meeting. We gathered in a maintenance bay between compressor housings and stacks of unused pipe collars. Reg came. Martin Hale came with Owen, and the same wrench he had nearly used on the chapel cradle. 9 more lower deck workers came. Cargo handlers, filtration techs, 2 electricians, a woman from cold storage whose brother had been sanctified last year. Their faces carried the hard, sleepless focus of people who had spent a week learning that grief had an electrical output. I told them everything I had so far. The power data, the deep hull, the founder's bones, the heading carved into the keel, the voice on the throne. The room split faster than I expected. Martin wanted the bridge stormed and Ashworth dragged off the throne before another body was fed to the ship. Reg wanted the mortuary chain disabled only if we had hard numbers on reserves and a way to keep the lower decks from freezing. Tamsin Vale from cold storage said both of them were thinking too small. If the dead were fighting to restore the founder's course, then perhaps the Ashworth line was the usurpation and the ship should be handed back to the original design. A cargo foreman named Joran backed her immediately. Maybe the ancestors are right, he said. Maybe the horror is ours because we've been living off a plan we no longer deserve to understand. Martin crossed the room so quickly Owen had to catch his arm. My son is in that wiring, Martin said. You call that legitimate again. You say it while looking at me. Joran did look at him. To his credit, he did not look away. I am saying none of us built this, he said. We inherited it. If the founders spent themselves to get us somewhere, maybe the crime is fighting them now. Easy to say when it isn't your boy twitching on the altar. Tamsin cut in before Martin could lunge. The question is consent. The founders had it. Tommy Hale didn't. And if we cut the chain, Reg said, what then? Gravity dip on the residential decks. climate failure, pumps starving. I've got children sleeping under 20 tons of plating. I am not offering them to your conscience because all of you want a moral position before breakfast." The bay went loud. Argument layered over argument. Grief, terror, doctrine, engineering. I let it run until the shape of the divide became obvious. There were 3 factions. Destroy the system entirely. Reform it from inside and keep the ship alive. Restore the founder's intention and stop pretending the living had authority to override the dead. They all looked to me in the end, which was unfair and inevitable. "What did the founders mean to reach?" Reg asked over the noise. I took the data slate out of my pocket and looked at the repeated glyph I had copied from the deep hull. Same orientation every time. "I don't know yet," I said. Martin swore at me. He was right to. Later, after the others had gone, Reg stayed behind with me among the compressor housings. He was rubbing at a crack in one knuckle where he had hit the table during the argument. "You hear yourself?" he asked. "You sound like you're already halfway below us in your head. That's where people go when they decide an answer is too grand to wait for practical consequences. The practical consequences are murdering the newly dead. The practical consequences are also my daughters smashing their teeth out when gravity cuts on 29. He stepped closer. "Curtis, listen to me. If we move with numbers." I told him I would try. He stared long enough to know I had not promised what he wanted. I went back to the deep hull alone. Reg had forbidden it in every way short of handcuffs. He was right that going without a structural partner was reckless. He was right that we needed reserve estimates more than revelation. He was right about nearly everything that mattered to keeping 6,000 people alive. 3 more days had passed since the bridge seizure. In those 3 days, 2 sanctifications had been conducted behind sealed doors despite the public suspension. The official line was equipment testing. The lower decks knew a lie when one was delivered in polished language. Anger had thickened into movement. Martin Hale was no longer the only man on his corridor carrying a cutting torch to bed. I modified my diagnostic interface using the cradle schematics I had pulled during Tommy's funeral. The cradle was built to handshake with fresh neural tissue. My rig was built to force a conversation with the fossilized network in the deep hull. I dropped through the pressure door at 0400 with my kit on my back and the ship half asleep above me. The bone corridors were colder than before, or I was noticing more. I followed the keel spine to the deepest junction I had found with Reg and knelt where 3 major filament bundles merged in the wall. My hands shook when I set the probe. I would like to say I hesitated because I was afraid. I did hesitate. The feeling was uglier than fear. It was hunger, need to know, sharpened until it felt like virtue. The probe made contact. The network accepted the connection. Pain hit first. It rose through me like something had seized the inside of my arm and yanked upward through marrow and tendon until my shoulder locked and my teeth cracked together. My display bloomed with data so dense it became texture rather than meaning. Waveforms collapsed into stacks. Coordinates nested inside fields of ratios. Timing sequences stuttered across the screen faster than the processor could stabilize. I did not hear voices. I understood fragments. A calculation vast enough to use every integrated nervous system in the ship as distributed substrate. A navigation problem of insane complexity. The signal I had been reading from the mortuary chain was not random, suffering converted to power. It was structured distress, productive distress, pain used as processing state. Crisis changed the nervous system's operating capacity. That much came through clearly. A body in extremis generated resolution no calm brain could sustain. The founders had known it. The modern system had industrialized it. Each new dead body added computational depth to a problem the ship had been solving since launch. A term surfaced through the torrent, translated imperfectly by my software into something like prior frequency. It was less a destination than a source geometry, a pattern in deep space background radiation older than stellar formation, buried in the oldest observable light. The ship had been triangulating it for 1,000 years. The modern dead sharpened the solution. The ancient dead carried the foundation. The Ashworth line had interfered with course correction. The network had resisted. Another layer rose through the data. Direction flooded my body, my inner ear, my spine, the equilibrium systems that tell a person where the floor is and which way a falling object will go. Those systems took a new reference. The knowledge settled in bone. I tore the probe free. Blood spilled from my nose onto the deck. My left hand had gone numb to the wrist. I sat against a calcified rib and tried not to vomit. The ship around me felt slightly wrong, as if the old down had been replaced by something larger. When I finally stood, I knew which way the prior frequency lay without consulting any instrument. I climbed back toward maintained corridors with my pulse hammering at the base of my skull. Garrett Lund was waiting beside the maintenance lift on subdeck 38. He looked like a man who had been standing there long enough to decide patience was another form of authority. "The Lord Ashworth requests your presence," he said. "Immediately." He did not ask where I had been. He did not need to. The network had already told him. Lund walked me to the bridge without guards and with the polite conversational ease of someone escorting a colleague to an audit review. He asked whether the parts allocation approved at the last audience had reached lower storage. He mentioned a ventilation complaint on subdeck 26. He said all of it in the same tone that made upper deck administrators sound civilized while reducing your options to one. The bridge was dimmer than on my first visit. Hairline fractures had spread through several load-bearing columns on the eastern wall. Fine cracks radiated from filament junctions in the calcified bone. The chamber had paid for the seizure. Perhaps Ashworth had as well. He sat the throne connected at every port. He looked worse, thinner than 8 days earlier, skin around the spinal interface inflamed and crawling red toward his hairline. His left eye lagged visibly now, receiving something at a delay his body could not hide. The tendrils pulsed against his arms. Lund sealed the door behind me and withdrew. Ashworth watched me the way a feverish man watches an unwelcome physician. "You've touched the deep substrate." I said nothing. They showed me the signature. He lifted one hand. The forearm tendrils moved with it, a nest of translucent lines sliding under irritated skin. "They notice everything. You left a mark in the old network. They also showed me a map of the people you've spoken to since Tommy Hale's funeral. Then you know what happens next." "I know what you think happens next." He leaned back against the throne and closed his eyes for a second, as if the effort of sitting upright had become negotiable. "You think you are about to lead an uprising against a dynasty that feeds the dead into a machine. You are correct. You are also about to discover that ending one atrocity does not prevent the one behind it from continuing." His voice was drier than I remembered, less regal, more exhausted. There was no performance in him now. He told me what the throne did. 7 lords, each one consumed faster than the last. His father had lost his vision in stages until the dead's navigational feed replaced ordinary sight. His grandfather had finished his final year speaking in coordinates, ratios, fragments of course correction tangled into domestic sentences no one around him could interpret. The First Lord had lasted nearly 30 years after formal enthronement. Ashworth estimated he might last 2 more, perhaps less, before the network overwrote whatever remained of him that it still considered individual. "When I sit here," he said, touching the throne arm with careful disgust, "I feel the calculation pass through me. I do not get the answer. I get the labor of it. Pressure, distress, their purpose. My body's distress improves throughput. So did my father's. So did his father's. We were never sovereign. We were throttles." I watched him while he spoke. He did not look like a tyrant defending his station. He looked like a man in the late stages of being annexed. "The mortuary chain made it worse," he said. "More power, more resolution, more dead. It stabilized the ship and accelerated the calculation. It also made the lie harder to see because every generation inherited it as kindness. You could have ended it. You think I didn't try? His good eye fixed on me. At 27, I proposed mandatory consent declarations before sanctification. The clergy called it doctrinal vandalism. Governance called it destabilizing. My own father, who could still speak mostly as himself at that point, informed me the lower decks would riot if we told them what the engines were. He wasn't wrong. By then the ship had two faiths built on the same machinery, the people who needed sanctification to be holy and the people who needed it to be necessary. He told me about the prior frequency, and this time the explanation filled the holes my interface had burned into me, instead of repeating them. Before Exodus, before the generation ships, before the collapse that drove humanity off Earth, deep space signal analysis had found a non-random structure in the cosmic microwave background radiation. It was not a message in any language or a transmission aimed at listeners. It was a pattern embedded in the oldest light, older than galaxies, older than stars. The geometry of that pattern converged on a point in deep space. The founders of the procession believed the convergence marked a prior architecture, something like intelligence, or a structure intelligence might emerge from, woven into the universe before matter settled into its familiar laws. No machine they possessed could compute a route precise enough to locate it. Human neural tissue could, especially in crisis. They chose agony as a tool, Ashworth said. They chose themselves first. Then they left the choice to inheritance, which is another way of refusing to leave it at all. He was silent for a moment. The tendrils at his forearms tightened and relaxed. I can still slow them, he said. Sometimes. I cannot stop them. I can slow them. That is what my line has been for 3 centuries. Delay, misalignment, human error on purpose. Enough resistance to keep the ship from arriving before the living have any say in what arrival means. I had not expected that. He saw it in my face. You wanted a cleaner villain. I wanted someone to blame who wasn't dead 1,000 years ago. You still have one. I let it continue. He said it without flinching. I let bodies go downstairs because keeping the ship alive with fewer dead required a political war I could not win from this chair while the dead used my own pain against me. There. Is that plain enough? It was. Then he laid out his offer. Publicly, end forced sanctification. Make mortuary processing voluntary. Bring engineering onto the bridge through a formal consulship. Let me help him reconfigure generation, reduce dependency, and hold the ship together long enough to negotiate with the dead rather than lose it to them. Privately, beneath all that language, help me. Sit beside me. Share the weight. Become another mind inside the fight. You interfaced with the substrate and lived, he said. That matters. The network notices you. It will notice you more if you oppose it. If you work with me, we may yet keep the ship human. I studied the man on the throne and saw the weakness under the offer. The lower decks are already moving, I said. You know that. Yes. You can't stop them. He did not answer. You can't stop the dead either. They've been overriding navigation for weeks. The lower decks feel it every time the engines surge. They're accelerating. You're losing control of both sides. You want me because I understand the grid well enough to manage the damage when they collide. Ashworth's left eye tracked to me. His right was fixed elsewhere, reading whatever layer of invisible pressure the throne fed him. And what do you think happens? He asked quietly. When there is no lord left to restrain them at all. I had no good answer. That was the last useful thing he gave me. I spent the night in the lower maintenance archives with Reg and Martin, and a reserve model that refused to become merciful no matter how often we reran it. If we destroyed the mortuary chain, we would cut roughly 40% of recent generation capacity off the grid. The exact share varied by season, by population stress, by how much supplementary draw the modern dead were handling for the old network's calculations. The founding substrate was deeper, more integrated, less efficient, still active. It had carried the ship for generations before the mortuary chain scaled up into system-wide dependence. It might carry us again. Might. The word sat in the room like a chemical smell. Martin did not care about probabilities. He had cared for 10 days. 10 days was all the restraint grief had left him. Reg cared about nothing else. "If we do this," he said, tapping the reserve chart, "we hit emergency amber inside minutes. Climate lag 6 to 8 hours. Gravity fluctuation immediate. Water recovery starts dropping unless we can reroute storage manually. On 29, nursery heat goes first if somebody in Central tries to protect the upper decks." "We keep them from protecting the upper decks," Martin said. "With what? Righteousness?" "With wrenches if we have to." Reg rounded on him. "My children are not a slogan, Martin." Martin stood. For 1 second I thought they were going to come to blows. Then Martin sat back down and covered his face with both hands. "I'm sorry," he said into his palms. "I'm sorry, I just can't—" He broke off. When he looked up again, his eyes were red, furious, and tired enough to make age visible in him. "Tommy used to leave his boots in the corridor," he said. "Every day. I told him every day to move them before somebody broke a neck. Last week I nearly tripped over them and started shouting for him before I remembered. That's what I get now. Boots in a corridor and the sound he made on that table. So don't ask me to be patient while they feed somebody else's son to the ship." Nobody spoke for a while after that. Reg rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not asking for patience. I'm asking for an order of operations that doesn't murder 6,000 people trying to save the dead." I looked at the charts until the numbers blurred, then at the schematic of the mortuary processing level, then at the memory of Ashworth in the throne, asking what happened when the dead had no restraint. "We cut the chain," I said. Reg shut his eyes. "We cut only the mortuary chain," I went on. "Not the deep substrate, not the throne, not the bridge. The founders chose their part. The modern dead didn't. We sever the interfaces and the transfer relays, leave the ancient network intact, and see whether the ship can stand on what it was before it started feeding on the newly dead." "That isn't a plan," Reg said. "That's an amputation." "Yes." He looked at me for a long time, then at the reserve model. "If Central locks down and traps us below, we work fast. If the first relay cut triggers automatic compartment seal, you get us through it." He let out a breath that sounded like surrender and disgust mixed together. "I hate that my skill set keeps making your decisions possible." Martin picked up the wrench. "When?" "Oh, 200, I said. "Before day shift. Before the next sealed ceremony." No one asked what came after. Maybe because no one believed in after anymore. Only next. We went with 11 people through service corridors the public never saw. Reg led us past a coolant exchange line and through a maintenance shaft that opened behind the mortuary processing deck's west wall. Martin was directly behind me, carrying the wrench in one hand and a cutting torch in the other. Owen came with him. Tamsin Vale came from cold storage because she knew the deck layout better than any of us. 2 electricians brought bypass cutters and insulated gloves. The rest carried whatever lower deck people always carried when institutions failed them. Tools heavy enough to become arguments. The processing level was larger than the chapel above it and honest in the way factories are honest. Tile, drain channels, bundled conduit. Heavy equipment mounted to the deck on vibration dampers. 14 Sanctification cradles in 2 rows, stripped of liturgical casing. Bare spinal taps, interface arms, transfer couplings feeding the main bus. Upstairs, grief was wrapped in cloth and scripture. Down here it was industrial design. 1 cradle was occupied, not active, prepared. A body lay under a thermal cover with the face turned away from us. Beside it stood Deacon Wills in shirt sleeves with 2 acolytes and a governance technician. He had one hand braced on the cradle frame and looked up as our lights hit him. For a second, no one moved. The room recognized itself. Martin's breath changed. That was all the warning I had before he crossed the floor. I caught him around the chest. Owen got his arm. The wrench swung once through empty air and hit a support post hard enough to ring. Wills did not retreat. His face had gone bloodless, but he stood his ground. "You're too late," he said, and his voice shook on the word late as if he despised himself for choosing it. "For what?" Martin said. "To save another body from you?" Wills looked at the covered shape on the cradle. "The family signed consent." "After what you told them?" Tamsin said. "After what exactly?" The governance technician reached for a wall alarm. Reg hit him with a shoulder and drove him sideways into a panel before he could slap it. One of the acolytes cried out. The other ran for the east door. Owen went after the acolyte. I never saw whether he caught him because the whole room lurched as Martin brought the wrench down on the nearest interface arm and shattered it at the joint. The alarm tripped anyway. Red shutters started descending over the outer exits. Emergency klaxons hit at once. Reg swore, left the technician groaning on the deck, and sprinted for a maintenance cabinet built into the west wall. 3 minutes before the fire doors seal fully, he called. That woke everybody. The deck became work. Martin and Owen on the first cradle. Tamsin and one electrician on the occupied unit, ripping the transfer leads loose before anyone could think to ask whether that was gentler than letting the process start. The second electrician moved with me toward the bus junctions along the south wall. Behind us, Will stood in the middle of the room like a man trying to decide whether his life had any remaining shape if he failed both God and governance in the same hour. Help or move, I told him. He stared at the exposed machinery, at the body on the cradle, at Martin Hale dismantling the apparatus with a violence too precise to be random. Then Wills pulled off his deacon's collar, tossed it aside, and went to the nearest power transfer manifold with both hands. He knew where to strike. That surprised me more than anything else in the room. The first relay cut sent a hard shudder through the floor. Lights dipped to amber. Somewhere above us, a warning tone started cycling through the ventilation system. The second relay cut dimmed half the deck. Reg had the maintenance cabinet open to the service guts and was bypassing the descending shutters manually, fingers moving fast over corroded contacts. "Curtis," he said, "if central senses a cascade fault, it'll hard isolate the whole level." "I'm aware. Be more useful about it." We moved faster, coupling 3, 4, 5. Each severed line dropped current on my handheld display. Transfer load fell in stair steps. The ship answered with every loss. Gravity fluttered once hard enough to make my stomach lurch. Somewhere in the corridor beyond the shutters, boots hammered toward us. Security or clergy or both. One of the cargo handlers froze midway through a swing. "My brother was on one of these," she said, staring at the row of stripped cradles. Tamsin grabbed her face in both hands. "Then break it harder." The woman did. Wills took a pry bar to the occupied cradle's spinal mount. Martin cut through the central interface spine with the torch. The body under the thermal cover did not move. For that mercy alone I was grateful beyond language. At Relay 8, the emergency lights nearly failed. The room went dark for a beat, then recovered in throbbing amber. Reg slammed a cabinet panel shut with his forearm and said, "West shutters held, east is gone." The acolyte Owen had chased did not come back. That meant security would. "Finish the bus," Reg said. I hit relay 9, 10, 11. At 12, the current on my display collapsed to 0. The mortuary chain went dark. The ship lurched so violently, Martin had to catch himself on the ruined cradle. All the deck lights died. For 2 seconds we had nothing but the blue-white ghosts of instrument screens and the red bars on my diagnostic unit. Then, from somewhere deep below our feet, another system answered. Cold light spread through the walls. It came from the fossilized filaments threaded through the structure itself. The ancient substrate surged awake to compensate. The processing deck, the corridor outside, the very bones of the ship began to glow from within. Emergency amber returned, weaker than before but steady. Gravity stabilized. The ship had lost a limb and was still standing. Martin sank onto the deck beside the destroyed cradle and started crying with the exhausted private grief of a man whose rage had finally found something to hit. Wills leaned both hands on a dead manifold and bowed his head. Reg checked my display, did the fastest calculations of his life in silence, then said, "We're alive. For now." The boots in the corridor had stopped. That frightened me. No one was trying to break in because something larger had taken priority. I knew what it was before the first harmonic reached us through the floor. The hull was singing. We followed the sound upward. Not music exactly. A structural resonance just above hearing, rising through the ship's bones. Every exposed neural filament in the walls glowed with the same blue-white interior fire. The maintenance corridors had turned cathedral. The ship was drawing on reserves it had hidden from us for 1,000 years, or burning through ones it had never expected to spend all at once. By the time we reached the bridge level, people were pouring into the corridors from every direction. Governance stewards, lower deck workers, 2 medics, a group of clergy in half-buttoned coats, Lund moving fast through all of them with the fixed face of a man who had run out of prepared responses. The bridge doors stood open. Lionel Ashworth was flying the ship. He sat the neural throne with every port engaged, his head thrown back, his hands moving over controls I had not seen during petition sessions. Manual overrides built into the throne itself, levers and calcium switches grown from the bone arms. His fingers moved too fast. Input cascades flashed across the archaic displays built into the walls. His eyes showed only white. The dead had him completely. The mortuary chain's destruction had silenced the modern dead and concentrated the old network through the one remaining high-bandwidth connection on the ship. Ashworth had become a terminal. Every skull in the bridge walls glowed, every vertebral pillar, every fused cage of ribs. The chamber was bright enough to hurt. Lund stopped beside me and whispered, "What have you done?" I almost answered him. Then the ship decelerated. Hard. The force hit like impact. Everyone still standing slammed forward. I went to one knee against the bone floor and felt the air forced out of my lungs. Somewhere behind me, glass shattered. Someone cried out. The deceleration held, brutal and sustained, long enough for my vision to constrict. Then it stopped. The procession, which had been in motion since before anyone alive had been born, was still. People got up slowly, stunned and disoriented in the silence. The bridge displays reconfigured themselves in the walls, ancient sensor fields trying to describe what the ship had reached. Conventional instruments read emptiness. No star, no world, no rubble field, no known source. My body knew better. The directional pull left behind by the deep hull interface vanished in the instant of arrival. It did not weaken. It disappeared because there was no farther direction to point. In its place came saturation, uniform, omnidirectional presence pressing through my spine and inner ear, and the scar of pain the interface had left in my nerves. We were inside the signal. My handheld agreed. Every sensor that could register the prior frequency was buried in it. The reading came from everywhere at once, surrounding us, under us, through us. A mathematical structure older than ordinary matter, present at a point space looked at and called empty only because matter-based instruments lacked a category for what they had found. The ship's bones resonated with it like a struck tuning fork. Ashworth collapsed. The tendrils withdrew from his body with a wet, mechanical finality. His head sagged. His arms fell loose. He slid from the throne and hit the floor on his side. He was breathing. His eyes were open. They tracked nothing. Lund dropped to his knees beside him and touched 2 fingers to the Lord's throat. After a second, he looked up at me with the face of a man whose hierarchy had just become anatomy. "Alive," he said, and even he sounded unsure whether it mattered. The glow in the bridge walls died all at once. Every skull, every rib, every filament. Dark. The harmonic in the hull faded into silence so complete it felt occupied. The dead were gone from the system, or finished, or had spent whatever remained of themselves in the final calculation. The throne sat inert in the middle of the chamber. The bridge, stripped of its inner light, became only a room made of bone. People kept entering, lower deck workers, the rest of my sabotage team, security who had forgotten to arrest anyone, clergy who no longer knew what office they held. Martin Hale came through the doors with soot on his sleeves and stopped when he saw Ashworth's body on the floor. He walked to the throne first. He looked at the ports, the withdrawn tendrils, the empty white face of the last lord. Then he turned to me. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice was quiet enough to make the whole bridge listen. "I broke the mortuary chain," I said. "No new dead will be processed." "And the rest of it?" I looked at the dark walls. The founders reached what they were aiming for. Whatever powered the old network, they spent it getting us here. Here where? I checked my display again, even though it would not become kinder. The prior frequency saturated every reading. The external viewports showed nothing but featureless dark. "We're at the source," I said. Reg came to my side and read over my shoulder. I felt him reaching the same numbers I had. Finite reserve, no generation, minimal propulsion. A ship designed to move forever now stopped in a place ordinary instruments could barely describe. "Can we use it?" he asked. "The signal?" "I don't know. Can we study it?" "Maybe. Can it kill us?" I looked at the screens, then at the quiet throne. "Probably." Martin laughed once, sharp with disbelief. "Good. Nice to know the future's still honest." Behind him, the crowd thickened around the bridge entrance. Faces turned to me because I was the one who had broken the visible machine. Faces turned to Lund because he was still wearing governance insignia. Faces turned to the dark throne because habit is difficult to kill. One of the lower deck workers spoke first. "Do we need another lord?" The question moved through the chamber like a small cold wind. Lund looked at Ashworth. Wills, who had come up from processing with dust on his sleeves and no collar at his throat, looked at the throne and then at me. Reg looked sick. Martin's hand tightened on the wrench. I understood in that second how quickly institutions regrow around vacant machinery. "No," I said. No one moved. I stepped onto the raised floor around the throne because people needed to see who was speaking, and because I was tired of pretending decisions happened somewhere else. "We're done with lords," I said louder. "We're done with this throne. We're done feeding bodies to the ship. No clergy decree, governance order, panic, or cold season gets to bring it back. The dead once chose something terrible. We inherited the habit. We end it here." Martin came up beside me, looked once at Ashworth's vacant body, then swung the wrench into the nearest interface stem. It cracked. The sound rang through the dead bridge like a verdict. Nobody stopped him. Reg joined us a second later with a maintenance bar from the wall cabinet. He hesitated only once. One glance at me, one glance at the remaining tendrils, then drove the bar down through the spinal mount of the throne's main feed. Calcium shattered, translucent filament splintered. Old technology died like brittle bone because it had become brittle bone. Lund flinched at the first blow. By the third, he was helping clear the fragments. That was the living choice the dead had not made for us. When the throne was no longer capable of seating anyone, I climbed down and started giving orders because the alternatives were silence and panic. "Open every upper deck store ledger," I told Lund. "No restricted inventory. If we're rationing, we ration from one ship, not two." He nodded. It took him a second, as if he had never before been addressed in command language by somebody from the lower decks. Then he nodded again, harder. "Done. Reg, get me reserve maps, climate priority routing, gravity redundancy, every battery stack and thermal sink still functional. Already working it. Wills." He looked at me as though he still expected judgment before usefulness. "You know every family with a body currently in cold storage. You go to them yourself. You tell them the truth before anybody else gives them doctrine to hide inside." His face pinched, but he said, "Yes." Martin was still breathing hard from the destruction of the throne. I put a hand on his shoulder. I need lower deck crews in assembly bays within the hour. People who can strip non-essential systems without causing cascade failure. He stared at me for one beat, then nodded. I'll get them. The bridge became a work site. Not orderly. Too frightened for that. Too human. People moved because movement beat staring into the dark. Medics took Ashworth away on a stretcher while Lund signed whatever made governance function until governance could be rebuilt into something that deserved the word. Reg commandeered a wall display and started rerouting load priorities with 2 electricians from the sabotage team. Wills left without vestments and without the steady walk clergy used when they wanted to look chosen. I stood at the viewport once the first wave of orders was moving and let myself look outward. Nothing. Then more than nothing. The eye saw void. The instruments saw pattern. My body felt pressure without weight, resonance without sound, the vast presence of the prior frequency pressing against the hull and passing through it. It offered neither threat nor comfort. It was simply there, a structure older than stars waiting at the end of a route purchased with 1,000 years of human pain. The reserves would last weeks, perhaps a month if Reg was right, and if upper deck stores were larger than governance records admitted. After that, we would have to do what the founders had never planned for. Build a future that did not require suffering to run. Martin came to stand beside me after a while. His grief had not eased. It never would. It had changed posture. "Tommy's gone," he said. I did not lie to him. "Yes." He nodded once. "Good." We stood in silence. After a minute he asked, "Do you think they found what they wanted?" The founders, he meant. The dead. All those bodies turned to architecture and current and purpose. I looked at the darkness outside, at the signal saturating every instrument I had, at the bridge around us now reduced from holy machinery to a room full of workers and frightened officials and people learning that inheritance could be refused. "I think they found something," I said. "Whether it was worth what they spent to get here isn't their question anymore." He considered that. "Whose is it?" "Ours." That was all. He sat down on the bone floor by the viewport and set the wrench across his knees like a tool again instead of a weapon. After a little while, Reg joined us with a data pad in one hand and grease across his forehead. Lund came later, still in formal clothes, carrying 3 opened store manifests and looking like a man who had aged into honesty in a single afternoon. Others followed. Lower deck workers, a pair of medics, Tamsin from cold storage, Owen. Eventually Wills, after he had done the hardest walk on the ship and come back with the face of a man who would never again mistake liturgy for innocence. One by one they settled among the inert bones. Nobody prayed. Nobody asked the dead for instruction. We looked out at the void and the impossible signal hidden in it. The prior frequency remained steady, enormous. It made no demand. It offered no blessing. It did not care whether we called it source, architecture, intelligence, relic, physics, or God. It had been waiting since before waiting had anything alive to mean. I sat on the floor and put my palm against the cold deck. The surface answered with silence. There was no glow, no current, no computation, only mineral, calcium, and the petrified labor of people fierce enough to turn themselves into a vessel for a future they would never see. The ship around us was finite now. Air, heat, water, food, salvage, time. All the practical brutalities Reg had been right about from the beginning. We would spend the coming days pulling apart the systems built to feed on the dead and turning whatever could still be used toward keeping the living alive. We would ration. We would fight. We would probably fail in several ways at once before we learned how to do anything else. Still, the throne was broken. The chain was broken. For the first time in the procession's history, 6,000 living people were stranded together in a silence no longer maintained by ancestors, clergy, or hereditary pain. Outside the hull, The oldest signal in the universe waited. Inside it, in a ship built from human suffering and finally denied more of it, we began.